We'd like to see a criminal justice system that no longer harms survivors and their loved ones. We'd like to see the full funding of prevention services, survivor services, and harmful behaviour services. And we also want to support the considered and the creation of pathways for appropriate services for all of our diverse identities and needs as impacted by sexual violence, and to ensure space and priority and resourcing to our Māori partners. We are really excited about this discussion tonight. We look forward to hearing from our candidates, and we appreciate your contribution to this important topic. Thank you.
Kia ora, Kyla and Fiona. So obviously I'll just run through who's taking part in the panel tonight. We've got Jan Logie from the Green Party, Porter Williams from Labour, Jessica Hammond from TOP or the Opportunities Party, Tracy Martin from New Zealand First, and Barbara Kuriga from National. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We did approach all the parties, and the parties that you see represented tonight are the ones who did respond. So thank you very much for taking part in this very important kōrero. We did get a lot of questions from the public, and we only have an hour. So unfortunately we can't get to all of them. We've got kind of 5 key questions that we're going to go through, and I'll do my best to get through them quickly. And I know it's an election year, everybody, but try and keep your answers nice and succinct. Okay, so let's get started. We're also going to do opening and closing statements. So let's get started with an opening statement from Porter Williams.
Kia ora, and thank you very much for having me on this call. I just want to reaffirm Labour's and the government's commitment to the sector in the elimination of sexual violence and the harm that it causes. Labour demonstrated its commitment to the sector through the initial funding boost in 2018 budget, and then of course the stabilisation funding that happened in 2019 to support access to services for victims in crisis, male survivors, support through the justice system, kaupapa provision, and of course services for those with harmful sexual behaviour and ideation. But there's so much more to do, such as dealing with the volume and the access to porn by our young people, successfully completing the sexual violence bill in a timely way that formalises the pilot work to improve the responsiveness in our criminal justice system, having greater emphasis on needs to be placed on prevention, including funding programs that demonstrate respectful relationships and the understanding of consent, and making those more readily available to a large cohort of young people, addressing the physical health needs of survivors, as well as investing in trauma support and counselling, and seeing integration work across the family violence and sexual violence sector to better and more quickly engage the specialist sexual violence work in the victim's therapeutic journey. Using established public health platforms like E Tu Whānau and Pacifica Proud to reach into those communities with education and support, and working with local government on safety planning, for example, for public events, including safe zones. More should be done to smooth the path to disclosure for those with historical complaints, and recognising the significance of the contribution that you make as clinically trained staff to be rewarded appropriately, and also to have your clinical practice adequately supervised and supported. There's much to do, and Labour hopes that we can continue this work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to Tracy Martin, and forgot to include the question for the opening statement, which is, what is your party's vision for responding to and ultimately ending sexual violence in Aotearoa?
Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Martin Te Whānau, ko Mohi Te Whānau Whāngai, ko Ngāti Kahungunu Te Iwi, ko Tracy Takuingoa. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I've done a lot of work in this space, and I deliberately employed Lisa Close, who was the secretariat to the Glen inquiry, to advise me in this area, because I don't carry the same experience that both Jan Logie and Porter Williams do coming into this space. But what is obvious is what you've already articulated, is that prevention, there has not been the funding for prevention. We have waited until a crime has been committed and a woman has been harmed, predominantly a woman, but others have been harmed through sexual violence, and then we've invested and trying to repair. So policy on and the sexuality. I've been doing I'm going to do this. I've been doing for the last 3 years. And that includes now conversations around pornography. Our young people are using pornography as part of their education system for relationships. And I'm pleased to hear Poto say that Labor will actually participate in supporting further work to protect our young people in that, because it has been something I've had difficulty progressing in the last 3 years. It also covers consent. As part of my work with Minister Hipkins, I've also announced 40 curriculum leads to support the consistent delivery of that curriculum across New Zealand. We need to do more. But the other thing we need to do is we need to have a look, and if we had been able to advance the Tomorrow Schools reforms, we would have been able to require our secondary schools to implement a similar to the Healthy Relationships program created by Te Rito in Rodney, which stepped through for all of our students, both genders, all genders of our students, not only what does consent look like, what does coercive control look like, but actually how do you get out of it? How do you recognize it and then remove yourself from that relationship?
Right.
And the other thing I'll say...
Sorry, I might have to wrap you on the opening statement. We only have 2 minutes for those, but we will have plenty more time to answer questions. So let's move on to opening statement from Jan Logie.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Jan Logie. Really lovely to be here, and thank you so much for organising this, because it is a really important discussion for the whole country. So the Green Party believes that everyone has the right to control their own lives and be free from violence. That's kind of our vision and what we're working towards. And within that, obviously, that children have a right to be safe. But the reality is that the latest Crime and Victims Survey showed us that 24% of people in this country have experienced sexual violence, and that this is a major driver of harm in our communities in terms of mental distress, alcohol and drug abuse, delayed development, poor learning and employment outcomes, and compromised relationships. And none of that represents well-being. And so the Green Party is really proud to have been part of this government that has made this work a priority. And that I've got to say, I had a moment today, I was speaking on a United Nations panel on COVID response and on behalf of the New Zealand government, and got to hear one of their expert speakers say that domestic and sexual violence against women had gone up in every country in the world except New Zealand. And I really want to acknowledge the frontline workers and our community organisations who partnered with all of us in government to be able to deliver that result. And it's really, we've got so much more to do. We all know that. But I do think it's important to mark how far we've come and acknowledge a moment like that, because that is lives that represents. And so for the things that we're looking towards specifically in terms of our policy and the next government is recognising that ending sexual violence will require challenging gender norms, colonisation and other forms of discrimination within society and within government, and that we want the next government to extend support for community-led and kaupapa Māori early intervention approaches and work to address those root causes so that everyone is safe and supported, and that would be partly some of the mechanisms for that is establishing the enduring mechanisms for Crown to work in partnership with Māori and with people affected by violence, so that we build those feedback loops to actually keep us on track in this work and keep this work a priority. And it's also about ensuring all people in whānau are at the centre of the responses, and that they are culturally specific responses that are tailored to the needs of people and intersectional, and develop funding comprehensive prevention education and early intervention, and developing workforce capability, recognising that this is skilled work And we all have different roles to play in it, and we need to be feeling confident in doing that work and to be supported to do it. And ensuring that that is backed up by this national leadership of bringing together the whole of government response and making sure that community providers have secure, fully funded, long-term government contracts to respond to the needs of the people that they're supporting for as long as necessary. And ideally, that would get to agencies only having one contract, so they don't have multiple lots of reporting. And to continue to prioritise the work around justice reform and prioritising pathways, additional pathways for restoration and redress. Just
Okay.
some of them.
All right, great. Kia ora, thank you for that, Jan. And just a reminder, let's try and keep it quick, everybody. So moving on to Jessica Hammond, what is your party's vision for responding to and ultimately ending sexual violence in Aotearoa?
Kia ora tātou, ko Jessica Hammond tōku ingoa. Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it, particularly as the new kid on the block being given space here, and thank you so much to Respected Aotearoa and to Rape Crisis. I'd like to acknowledge that there is great expertise in this room, and I'm not an expert. We do have experts within our party, both in the legal system and in the NGO space, particularly around offenders. So, you know, that's I'm very proud to be among those experts. But tonight, I think you're not going to have a problem with me going over time. I'm here to, you know, whakarongo more than I could at all. In general, though, to give you an idea of the Opportunities Party's approach, we are dedicated to listening to experts and following the best advice from experts, some of whom are in this virtual room, and to addressing the root causes of problems like sexual violence. I see sexual violence as part of a system, I suppose, that is connected to sexual harassment, workplace harassment, intimate partner violence, and bullying. And we have huge problems with all of these things in New Zealand. So, as I say, we're dedicated to listening to the experts and addressing the root causes where we can. And we know that a lot of that comes down to cultural problems, power imbalances, toxic masculinity, and rape culture. And I know these things are hard, but I also know that there are amazing solutions in the room, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about those.
Excellent. Kia ora, Jessica. Thank you for that. And finally, Barbara Kuriger, what is your party's vision for responding to and ultimately ending violence?
Hi, good evening, everybody. And firstly, apologise for the, I'm currently in the back seat of a car, so you're probably better to just listen rather than watch, because watching my own phone, I seem to be moving all over the place on you. So, look, if I go back to when we were in government, we had social sector trials with which we had our communities and all of our organisations in our communities who were working with sexual violence and a whole range of other social issues in our community. And if I step back and look at that, a lot of those trials worked very successfully while we had all our organisations on the ground who understand it far better than we do, because they work with it every day. And as soon as it wasn't a trial anymore, all of a sudden when I guess the glue of a trial wasn't there to bring everybody together, none of the organisations tended to have that funding to continue, because they'd all do their bit, they'd all have their individual contracts. And then when it came to working together outside of that trial, it was finding that glue that fitted the whole community together. And I think the answers are in underpinning our communities, because they're the ones that actually understand and know the people. So really we've got to support the organisations, listen to the organisations, and just find out what the best things we can do to support them. But listening to everybody else on the call today, and I often mention the cross-party willingness of all our parties when we're in Parliament to, through the Commonwealth Women's Parliamentarians, or, you know, through our work when we're actually doing bills in the House right across party. I think that's the best way we're going to tackle this. This is bigger than all of us. This is something that we don't need for, we don't need people get different rules every 3, 6 or 9 years depending on who the minister is and who the government's in charge of. So, you know, I think we can make a commitment to work far more seriously on this together and underpin the organisations that are doing the work, because when the organisations who front this every day are, and it's also not just a women's issue as well, we have to deal with our men's organisations to make sure that we're all on the same page here. And we talked about behaviour before. I still think as a community we're really struggling to find those safe zones for people to go to when there is an issue, because the minute one person speaks up, next thing you can have 2, 3, 4 or 5 or lots of people who have experienced the same issue. So I think as a society we've actually got to work far more on where is the safe zone when somebody's been affected, where is it they can go to find a safe haven, to talk to somebody, to get a solution to their issue. And I think when we get to that point, sometimes it's years before people actually have the opportunity to speak up. So we've got to shorten that time period.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Okay, so moving on to the questions. Question 1, Wellington Rape Crisis and Respect Ed's Te Tiriti partners in this work have a prioritised focus on the uplift of Māori children by Oranga Tamariki. They identify systemic issues of racism and harm and the flow-on impacts on sexual violence and domestic violence. The question is, where does your party stand on ensuring that decisions about mokopuna lie with iwi, not with Oranga Tamariki? What will you do in the short term? What will you do in the long term? And just a reminder, you've only got a minute to answer this question, and I will throw to Tracy Martin.
Can I just say it's ridiculous to have a minute to answer this question? This is one of the most important questions this country's got, and a minute could not possibly do it justice. What I want to say is, though, that Oranga Tamariki, we've got, what have we got? A 44% drop since 2017 in children coming into care. We've got a 50% decrease in the number of babies under the age of 1 coming into care since 2017. 66% of children who are in the state's care are in the care of whānau. Over 90% of the children who come to the care, into the attention of Oranga Tamariki, are there because of family violence. The removal of children did not create that family violence. That is one of the reasons why Oranga Tamariki gets called. We have 4 strategic partnerships with iwi. We have one with the Māori Women's Welfare League, 68 years after they asked a government to partner with them. I'm signing another strategic partnership tomorrow with iwi. I'm signing another strategic partnership on the 25th. We are moving this. You are absolutely right that community and iwi must be involved in prevention, early intervention and intensive intervention to stop children being in a situation where the state needs to step in. The state cannot raise children, but the pathway is there through Po Aotearoa and the operating model, and it has been funded by this government, and we are turning this ship around. But if we don't turn family violence around, and that's not Oranga Tamariki can't do that, then we will continue to have situations where children need to be taken into care.
Okay, thanks for that, Tracy. And yes, I acknowledge 1 minute is not really enough, but it is 1 hour is all the time we have. So apologies for that, but I am going to have to be fairly strict on it. Okay, so let's move on to Jessica Hammond.
Kia ora. Yeah, I mean, as a party, the Opportunities Party has a commitment to tiriti, and you know, the thing about New Zealand is we have the most sort of centralised system of government of anywhere in the OECD. So we are very committed to devolving services and power to local communities, to iwi and hapu as much as possible. We know that Oranga Tamariki does take away dignity and autonomy from whānau, and that certainly has to change, and that can be a whānau-led process. So I'm really pleased to hear from Tracy that some of that work is underway, and we'd support that continuing.
Thank you. Porter Williams, your response.
Kia ora, thank you. I'm really pleased that Tracy brought up Pō Aotearoa because it kind of frames my thinking around this. Significant partnerships need to occur with iwi, not just in terms of them being at the table, but they need to absolutely direct the direction of traffic in this space. And one thing that I think we really need to do is we need to look at who actually leads our organisations. Our people understand our needs best, and the heads of our public service organisations need to come from Aotearoa, because if we're using models like Pō Aotearoa, for example, we cannot have people who come in from other places who don't understand these significant cultural concepts in terms of how we support our kids. Uplift should be the absolute last resort. We need to be positive and affirmative for our families and our whānau, and understand that the families are a mix and a range of people, including grandparents, and they need to be supported. We need to use the tools that we currently have around group conferences and whānau hui, but they need to be in the places and the spaces that make sense to the whānaus that are impacted. And we need to support our families better, whether that's through housing adequacy or income adequacy or just keeping our tāne out of jail. In that regard, we need to do, we all need to think about the cannabis referendum and the impact that will have on keeping our men out of jail and not criminalised. Genuine engagement, it needs to happen, and I just want to say that the state is a bad parent, and we need to do so much more to ensure that our families stay together, that these children stay with their mothers.
Cool. Kia ora, Porto. Barbara, your response, please.
Yeah, actually, I think we're all speaking the same language here tonight, because children do need to stay with their whānau. And, you know, some of the work that's been going on definitely needs to be continued. We're making progress in that direction. And it's not the ideal thing for children to be taken away from their whānau or their family. I do want to reiterate, in the short time I've got, grandparents have been mentioned, and they're a really integral part of society. And I've spent quite a lot of time with the group's grandmothers raising grandchildren, or grandparents raising grandchildren. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done there in terms of bringing them in as part of this, because they really do some fantastic work. And I think the recognition for those people is not there yet. So we need to support them in supporting their whānau to support their babies. So I'm on track with what everybody else has been saying.
Oh, thanks, Barbara. And I've just been told that we can cut a question, so hopefully that gives everybody a little bit more time to talk about their points. So moving on to criminal justice, there are many reports, papers and research on the current criminal justice system and its impact on survivors of sexual violence. The latest figures from the Crime and Victims Survey shows 94% of sexual assaults weren't reported to police, an absolutely staggering figure. Many survivors and their families have described the devastating additional harm the criminal justice system has caused them. So Respect Ed and Rape Crisis are firm supporters of the sexual violence legislation bill currently going through Parliament. Is your party committed to passing this legislation as is, and what timeframes can you commit to for survivors in the next term? We'll go to Jessica.
Thank you, Kristen. I think Jan might have missed an answer to the last question, though.
Oh, apologies. I'm so sorry. I got distracted.
It's all right. Don't worry. You can either choose for me to answer it now or answer it with the next question.
No. We will. We'll go back to Oranga Tamariki. So where does your party stand on ensuring?
Right. So the Greens take our responsibility to tangata whenua to reset the relationship with the Crown, so that Tino Rangatiratanga is on it, and we recognise that actually there's a long way to go to do that, and it's been really great to see an agency set up within government, Te Arawhiti, to actually start building that capability within the Crown. And our plan in this area is to implement Ko Te Wā Whakawhiti, the report on the Māori inquiry into Oranga Tamariki, that identified 3 key areas for action, but has a huge amount of detail to it. The areas are: 1, supporting whānau, strengthening capability and capacity. The second being a structural analysis and review of Oranga Tamariki systems. And I really want to point out in this that they also note the need to review inter-agency accountability and family court processes and inter-agency collusion and targeting processes. This is a system issue in actual fact. A lot of attention has been on the one agency, but actually police, some of our refugees as well, part of this issue, and we have to deal with this if we're going to be effective. The third transition to get there in the community. And this work is
Ed and Rape Crisis are firm supporters of the sexual violence legislation bill currently going through Parliament. Is your party committed to passing this legislation as is, and what timeframes can you commit to for survivors in the next term? We'll go to Jessica, please.
Kia ora, thank you, Kristen. Yeah, we absolutely support this legislation, and well done to Jan and others on that. It is, alleviates a lot of the stress for complainants, and I've spoken to our deputy leader, Shaina Bohr, as a former Crown prosecutor, and I took her advice on this, and her view, and I'm sure it's one that Jan and others share, is that it doesn't curtail judges' discretion. They are still able to ensure justice for defendants, and they are still required to ensure justice for defendants. So this is a win no lose kind of situation. So we would absolutely support it, in short.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Barbara. Do you think it is a win no lose situation, this bill? Oh, do we
Still on mute? Yeah. Look, we've certainly got it's a grueling experience for women to be going through. I mean, it's bad enough what they have to go through with any sexual violence or any form of violence, but when they start going through court processes, it becomes absolutely, I've been actually having conversations just in the last few days with women who find that, it brings it all up again, but the process is confusing. Look, anything that we can do to help women, within that process has got to be good. So, barring the detail, and there's a bit of work to be done yet, but the direction of this is really good.
Okay, excellent. We'll move on to Tracy. I understand your party has had some reservations about this bill.
So my party didn't have a representative on the select committee. I'm interested that Barbara is supportive of the legislation because the National Party did not vote for it to go through in its current form at the select committee. And actually Chris Penk has written several amendments to the bill that he's asked New Zealand First to support that we have not declined. There are 2 things that I have recommended to my caucus. We didn't have anybody on the select committee, so then when all the raru came up from the defence lawyers, I had to go and find out what the hell was going on, and I had to do that relatively quickly. At that time, there were 3 weeks left of the Parliament, and 300 cabinet papers were being put through at the same time. Literally, we ran out of time. I've made 2 recommendations to my caucus, and I believe that that bill would go through within if we could come to an agreement on the 2 recommendations that I have made. The first one is that around the pre-recording of testimony, that we first of all trial it with children and those who are and vulnerable adults, similar to what the UK did, while we run a pilot on a sexual violence court, similar to what the UK did. The second sticking point has been the ability for the sexual history between the complainant and the accused to be allowed to have to be justified before it is brought into the courts. My recommendation to my caucus is that I do not accept what the defence lawyers have said, that it removes the right of silence. So I believe, given the time I need to actually educate the New Zealand caucus, which is what I asked for, then I believe that that legislation can move forward, but it would have to move forward with probably those tweaks.
Tracy, can I clarify what I just said? I said we are supportive of the direction of doing something, but barring the detail. And you know, that's exactly in the 1 minute I had. You know, that means for further discussion, and let's deal with some of those issues that some of us are a bit stuck on. But it's the direction we have. You know, the direction is good.
Okay. All right. We'll move on to Jan. The Greens supportive of passing this bill as is?
Yeah, we are. Sorry, yes, we are, and as soon and in an unamended form is our preference. And I just want to point out that the last Crime and Victims survey showed that only 6% of people who had experienced sexual violence had actually reported it, and that the Law Commission's work showed that one of the reasons for that was because of the significant levels of secondary re-victimisation in our court. Which they believed contributed to lower rates of reporting, which was also reinforced by previous Ministry for Women research that found fear and distrust of the legal system is one of the reasons victims don't report. And that we're hearing that people are saying who've been through it that they wouldn't do it again or advise their children to report because it was so re-traumatizing. And I just want to specifically address the points that Tracy raised around the keeping it to children. Our current law actually enables adults to be able to pre-record their evidence at the moment. So that would be restricting. The problem is, and why we're introducing this legislation in the way it's framed, is that there was a Court of Appeal ruling that was based on a much older Law Commission report that they led them to say that actually this should be restricted and only used in rare circumstances. So this legislation is to override that Court of Appeal ruling and to actually enable the existing law to be realised. And the UK example, about many countries, it's started with children and vulnerable witnesses, which usually, including I think in several of the UK jurisdictions, includes victims of sexual violence, all of them. So this is nothing in the legislation is new and hasn't been done anywhere. It's all been tried and tested and proven to be able to improve the experience of victims. And it feels to me that when I hear people tell me that they would advise their child against reporting because they don't want to see them go through a court process, and then we're responsible in government for that process that is hurting women and kids. I just feel like it's a moral duty to get on and do it because it's been decades of us being asked to do it.
Okay, Portal, your response?
Well, it's a hard act to follow. Totally, Tautoko Jan. We're committed to the passage of this bill, and I just want to reinforce some of the sentiments that Jan is making. The whole point of this is it's a difficult thing to actually put yourself forward anyway. And, you know, the way that the courts have operated have been to put the person who is presenting the evidence on trial. And that's completely not what we want. This to be a process where people actually feel that they are being heard, that they've been honoured, and that it doesn't mean that they have to suffer again the terrible trauma that they have experienced in the first instance. And you know, our legal system, because we have this notion of innocent until proven guilty, and this situation causes us some difficulty. So we have to find the mechanism with which we can ensure that those key principles of the legal system are upheld. But actually what needs to happen at the end of the day is that these brave people, including our children, who we want to ensure have the opportunity to present their case and get some justice, do it in a way that doesn't harm them forever. And our court system is not appropriate at the moment. So yeah, we want this to go through as soon as possible. It's looking likely, other than the tweaks that Barbara and Tracy indicate, that, but I suspect we may have some robust conversations when we get back to the House.
Kia ora, Portal, thank you for that. Okay, moving on to question 3, and this one is about accessing services. So there are significant coverage and appropriate service issues for sexual violence survivors across New Zealand. There's a massive inequity for those living in rural New Zealand who need to access support, and those from our rainbow, migrant, Pacific and disability communities are still needing more resourcing to design and deliver appropriate services for survivors and those with harmful behaviour. The question is, what is your targeted approach to addressing inequalities and making sure people are accessing the right support? And we'll go to Jan first.
Thanks. I think this question is at the heart of quite a lot of the work that we need to do. And I'd like to give some examples of some of the work that's been initiated this term that the Greens are really supportive of, as an indication of where our thinking is going and what we want to see develop and extended out. So this term there was the funding for the joint venture to develop prevention for diverse communities, specifically for disabled, migrant, older and LGBTQIA plus people. And this is, while this is funding for prevention, the intention of it was to actually use this as a stepping stone and build those relationships and connections into government to be able to develop appropriate responses and pathways for all of those communities. And that is being developed as intersectional work. So as just an example of what that might mean is that while Māori, obviously there's a partnership with the Crown, so, and they're not listed as a diverse community, that actually Māori are disabled and they're also older people, so that this will be a response that needs to engage Māori as well. It needs to be intersectional. The joint venture is also working closely with the Disability Rights Commissioner and establishing relationships with disabled people and their organisations to give us kind of an outside critique and bring them into the tent in terms of all this work and make sure that we are developing appropriate pathways and getting our response right for them, because they just have not been included and by the virtue of that have been excluded. And we're also in the early stages as well in the government of looking towards designing integrated community responses to sexual violence and family violence, and that's in its heart has to consider where those gaps are in terms of services, how we link services together and make sure that there's appropriate reach right into across the country and into the regions. And I specifically also want to just talk to around the need for us to make that right across the life cycle for all age groups, and that we've had traditionally divisions that haven't served us in terms of family violence here and sexual violence here and child abuse here and youth and old people, elder abuse over here. And actually we have to make sense of it all if we're going to eliminate those gaps.
Thank you, Jan. Moving on to Barbara, what is your targeted approach to addressing inequalities and making sure people are accessing the right support?
Yeah, look, one of the big issues that we've got, and you specifically mentioned rural communities before, which is also one of my portfolios, is we just don't have the right connections and points in rural communities to figure out where, people don't always know where to go. And so I think, we've got to make sure with all of our rural communities that we run the rural ruler over everything that we do, so that we have a handle on where are the right places for people to go. Because I think some of the services and some of the things that are happening now are very valuable, but they don't actually extend out into rural communities like we need them to. So my biggest concern is actually not so much what is happening, but it's how we make it fair and get it transferred across to everybody in our community. So that's something that I'm particularly interested in working through.
All right, well, we'll move on to Poto.
Cool. Just want to add perhaps a couple of things in that we do have a joint venture that is looking at a strategy to better connect up the work that we do across all of government. But there are two key agencies that perhaps aren't part of this, which should be, and that's the Office of Disability Issues and the Office of Ethnic Affairs. And being able to support those communities directly by having the connections into those communities is really important. But we're already doing some really great prevention work, and we have been for more than a decade through E Tūwhānau and Pacifica Proud. And their prevention strategies that have come out of the family violence space, for example, but are absolute opportunities for us to leverage those connections when we're working in sexual violence. Now, for the Pacific community in particular, this is a particularly difficult conversation to have. So having a respected partner, one that's worked with your community for 10 or 15 years in the area of family violence, actually gives us an opportunity to then leverage off that to work much more successfully in the sexual violence prevention area. You know, there are some great pieces of work that are happening all across government, but I think that Jan has really really hit the nail on the head. What we have to do is we have to do this collectively as an all of government approach, and getting our strategy finalised in terms of the work that we want to achieve and how we work in partnership across all of those government agencies is absolutely critical to this. And I think it's got to be an absolute priority for the new term to get that sorted so that we can then lay down the milestones and work in partnership with the sector about how we actually achieve that.
Kia ora, thank you. Tracy, your thoughts?
So I'm also a minister on the joint venture, and strangely enough, I'm there as the Minister for Seniors because seniors have been invisible in this space, and that was what I was trying to say earlier around sexual violence. It's not the norm of so we sit there. It's been hard work, the joint venture. It's been something absolutely new. We've learned a lot of lessons of it over the past 3 years. I don't think Jan or Poto would disagree with me to say that we had hoped we would be further down the track, but everything about working collaboratively and getting government agencies to not step up and design in the first place and then take it out and just do a little bit of a quick consult was never going to be easy. I want to give you an example of what we need to do with regard to the strategy. Ngāi Tahu is working with the Christchurch East o Rangatamariki office there on intensive intervention. They went to the families and they said, of the 120 providers in this geographical area, who do you trust? And they came back with 5. There are a lot of people in this space that say that they have the answer for our families, but we need to ask our families first. And the first thing we need to do when we get back into government, and from the joint venture perspective, is get on the ground and make sure that the consultation around the strategic document starts with our families, not with those already delivering, but the families, and find out what the themes are of the trusted places they already go.
Thanks, Tracy. Okay, and lastly, Jessica, what is your targeted approach to addressing inequalities and making sure people are accessing the right support?
Yeah, I mean, I think the support for survivors can be, can be good where it's there. Obviously, we need to up that massively. This is one of these, normally with TOP, we don't like ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. We like to have the fences at the top, but to the extent to which sexual violence is a heritable condition, because not everyone, but quite a few people who are who have their own trauma go on to offend. The ambulance at the bottom of the cliff is the same thing as the fence at the top. So we would, really like to support, give more support for organisations like, programs like She Is Not Your Rehab, and organisations like Shine. So, our approach is generally having support in the community and building preventative support to help people deal with the trauma they already have.
Kia ora. Thank you, Jessica. I'm just a bit conscious of time because it is nearly 7 o'clock and we have one more question to go. Is everyone happy to do one more question and then do the closing statements? Great. Okay. Last question. This one is around prevention work. So the current government has committed significantly more funds to survivor support services. However, there's been no significant increase to the funding available for prevention. As a special sexual violence prevention focused agency, Respected Aotearoa has been receiving only $60,000 annually in current government funding for sexual violence prevention for the last 5 years, aside from funding for delivery of ACC's Mates and Dates program for secondary school students. So the question is, what is your party's commitment to ensuring there is comprehensive sexual violence prevention funding available to ensure high quality sexual violence prevention initiatives, including education and training being available, and prioritising the populations who need it? So Tracy, please, we'll go to you.
So first of all, this government just invested what is it, something like $70 million or whatever. So we've just released the relationships and sexuality education curriculum, which finally, it's the first revamp since 2002. It finally has consent, coercive control, pornography, trans and gender issues. It finally updates it to the modern world. We've also invested in 40 curriculum leads to help schools be able to deliver that and have the conversations they are required to have with their community of parents to lessen the fear, to make sure that we can give our young people the education they are asking for in this place. So I am, though, going to defer to Jan on some of the things. I mean, Jan's more across what is the current funding, and I think she'll be a little disappointed to hear that communities are yet to see the funding, which is this $2 million of prevention across diverse communities that you've put in there. So, you know, I'm going to defer to Jan on that, because if anybody can kick, she can.
All right. Jan, off you go.
Okay. So the Green Party policy is around developing a comprehensive plan to appropriately prevent, respond to, and ultimately reduce levels of violence, and develop a coherent cross-ministry funding model and level of funding to meet the sexual violence crisis, recovery support, rehabilitation, and prevention. And I just want to pick up, I want to acknowledge the work that Minister Martin has done in education and those new guidelines, but particularly the curriculum leads that support it, more so than the curriculum update in itself, because actually that's been a really significant missing part of the puzzle. But I think I hear in this question, and I want to acknowledge that we've got more work to do, because it's not just about in schools. It is around a whole of life cycle and people's journeys and that chance to intervene where people are. And I also want to acknowledge that there's a history of family violence prevention programs saying that they also include sexual violence, but actually not. And that is where this real need and drive is for a separate sexual violence prevention strategy, and that there is an inequity in funding in those. Ultimately, I think we have to do the work across looking at what outcomes we want as a society to be for people to live free from violence, and bring sexual violence and family violence sectors in an intersectional way together to work out how we get there, including schools, including early childhood education, including campaign community mobilisation, including the work in workplaces. And I want to acknowledge the work that Respected has been doing in terms of, without the support of government funding, in terms of sexual harassment interventions, because we know that that work has multiple benefits in terms of people's relationships at home, as well as creating safety and better workplaces. So that there is a lot to do, and at least now we're got a joint venture to be able to join some of those things up in terms of breaking down those meaningless silos that we've had.
All right. Portia, your thoughts? Could more be done in the realm of sexual violence prevention?
I think prevention is the absolute key for us to actually, and it's something that I have talked about for a long time. And prevention is not just around programs around respectful relationships or consent. They actually, prevention in the sexual violence space also needs to include preventing harm from family violence, particularly in children, and really addressing the needs of kids who are experiencing violence in their homes to be able to become restored and whole and fulfilled, because often a precursor to sexual harm behaviour comes from an experience of family violence. So I think that there is, hand in hand, we need to work across both of the sectors to ensure that prevention becomes really important. But for sexual violence, as well as the things that Jan talked about, we've got opportunities to work with our local government as well. Because some of the sexual harm that happens does happen in spaces where we have events or where people gather and the like, and our local government has got an absolute role to play in supporting the development of safety plans for those events and safe zones. So that kind of covers the rest of the gamut that Jan didn't cover off there. But for me, you know, a dollar that we spend in prevention actually saves, you know, exponential in terms of harm. We have to start shifting the conversation, and that's where we need the sector to help us as well, because crisis is so immediate. We have to shift the conversation from dealing with crisis to the early intervention and prevention space, and we need for our sector to help us in that journey as well.
All right, thank you, Portal. And Jessica, we will go to you. What's your party's commitment to ensuring there's comprehensive sexual violence prevention funding available?
Yeah, I addressed some of this in my previous answer, but for us, we are massively invested in prevention over cure, recognising that in this space that cure and prevention are sometimes the same thing. I'm really thrilled to hear about the work that's been done on education. I have an 11-year-old who's coming back and reporting to me on what she's learning in her health classes. And for me, I think a lot of us are of an age where we didn't understand what consent was when we were younger, and didn't necessarily, both the victims and the perpetrators didn't understand that what they were doing was wrong. So I am really thrilled that that work is underway. But massive support for prevention, but also for you know, increasing the number and the funding for psychologists within the corrections system.
Thanks, Jessica. And lucky last, Barbara.
Yeah, look, if we're going to break the cycle, the one way we're actually going to get it is prevention. And the more we can do with education with our young people before, and hopefully cut off some bad experiences at the past before they actually happen. That's the only way we're going to break the cycle. On a whole range of other things, kids are the ones who speak up. Kids are the ones that are often, you know, open and honest if that's how we teach them to be. And we won't teach them to do that without actually having those conversations in schools. So, you know, we're really, you know, supporting those educational conversations.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And I got everyone in that one, didn't I? I believe I did. So there were going to be some additional questions at this point, but I assume, Kyla and Fiona, that we have run out of time for those. I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay, so yes, we have run over time, and thank you all so much for making yourselves available. So we will go to the closing remarks, please, and we'll go to Portal first.
And look, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being on board and the lovely robust conversations we've been happening. I'm going to have to leave after this, so I hope you don't mind. I'll just slip out, but just it's been great having this conversation. I want to say one of the things that I see as really important going forward is the rollout of the court support work for victims of sexual violence. It's really specialised work, but it's going to make a huge difference for those people who are engaged in court processes. I think that children having adequate and appropriate representation so that they aren't re-traumatised by the evidential process is going to be really important. Timely approvals by ACC, you know, for those to happen, particularly for those people who are bringing historical complaints to light, you know, where they're finally brave enough to bring this forward. It would be wonderful if we could speed up those processes, and that's something that we're really committed to doing. And ensuring that cultural iwi practices are included in our practices for healing people. And, you know, completing the strategy is going to be, I think, one of the things that we will really need to tackle with some haste when we hopefully come back as government. But I just want to say, just as a final word, I'm really proud of the way that we formed a really strong and trusting relationship with the sector, and that we're having robust conversations, and hopefully this is resulting in healing and hope. So, ciao everyone. Thanks for having me.
Kia ora, thank you, Portua.
Bye.
Okay, so with that, we'll move on to Tracy. Your closing remarks, please.
So thank you. As you can hear, well, this is a huge topic, and we're all pretty focused on it, but I want to say one thing: where are the men? So I want to put out a challenge to Porto's gone, but I'll put it out to her as well. I want to put out a challenge to any woman that is in the Parliament, that we get the Commonwealth Women's Parliamentary Group together, and we actually put a subgroup together that includes every party putting a man as well as a woman onto this topic. Because right now they're avoiding the topic because it's uncomfortable for them. And we know that we cannot shift this unless we all participate in the solution. Māori are, you know, are around healing families, and we have not really done that very well. So I guess my closing comment is a challenge to all of the women in Parliament in different parties to actually use their mechanism of the Commonwealth Women's Parliamentary Group to be able to pull together men into this conversation, so that we have advocates, not just us going into our caucuses. And I know, Jan, you've got a caucus that is overwhelmingly women, but the majority of us do not.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. An interesting challenge. Jan, your take on that and your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, we're at a bit of a disadvantage on that one, but who knows in the next Parliament. But though I do just want to say, in terms of the joint venture and the ministers that have been involved, that Minister Little and Minister Nash, as well as Minister Davison-Seale, have actually really engaged, and I feel as if they have taken a personal stake in this work, which has been really encouraging. I just, on a final note, just want to pick up on some random points that I haven't mentioned, and then thank everyone for their work. So one of them is acknowledging some of the ACC issue that Portal raised, and the long waiting lists that we still have there, and need to get more people into that work to be able to reduce those waiting lists, but also acknowledging Wellington Rape Crisis, for the model of care that they've been developing around a therapeutic social work model that enables an effective intervention before and possibly at times meaning that people don't need that ACC intervention. And I think that's quite exciting, because ACC has real limitations, and that I think the requirement for a diagnosis and the way that ACC is structured doesn't support the holistic needs of survivors. And I also want to acknowledge too a concern that was raised with me this week around the family court, and that people have seen courts starting to order children out of counselling for sexual violence treatment because of a belief of parental alienation, which was deeply concerning to me to hear. And that the Greens had a policy to put in specialist experts into our family courts to oversee the process and lead practice change in the courts, because it seems as if the education is moving fairly slowly. and that we have a lot of work to do overall in terms of just building that system of support and specialisation, particularly for our children. And so on that final note, I do just want to thank everyone for all of the direction and input that you've given me, but this government, this term. I know partnership is frustrating at times and that things don't move quickly enough, but I really hope that everyone is feeling our commitment, which has been universal across this government, and as I said at the beginning, the Greens have been really proud to be part of it.
Kia ora, thanks for that, Jan. Jessica, your closing remarks, please.
Kia ora, thank you. Tracy makes a good point about men getting involved. I'm pleased to say that in the Opportunities Party candidate pool, we do have men who are involved in that space, and I'd really like to acknowledge Ben Atkinson, our Banks Peninsula candidate, whose day job as a social support worker, who does a lot of work in this space, and I think he's incredible. And one point, which is just going to sound a little bit random, but today we had our infrastructure launch, and I'm about to head off to an infrastructure Facebook Live. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that almost all of the parties in Parliament are at the moment supporting infrastructure projects that cost sometimes billions of dollars and have cost benefit ratios of less than 1. So all of you who are working in this space, if you get told by government that there is not enough funding for this incredible work that has incredible returns on investment, it is not true. There is plenty of money. We have choices about where we spend it. Let's start investing in prevention and things that have incredible returns on investment for our well-being. Kia ora.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica. And lastly, Barbara.
Yeah, well, actually, earlier in the call, I mentioned that we're not going to solve this problem without men. And I also talked about the value of CWP, because Commonwealth Women's Parliamentarians, because actually, you know, there are some things in Parliament that we get hugely political about, and this is not one of those issues. This is one of those issues that I think we as women and men seriously need to get our heads together on and make sure we're in the right space. And I love a challenge, and Tracy's issued a challenge, and I'm sure, Tracy, I can get you at least a man, if not a few men, to actually join us in this process, because together, you know, we do have to solve this. Is not something that we can, you know, we can split hairs on. We've actually got to try and get our heads in the same room and work on this collectively. So that's a commitment from me.
Kia ora, Barbara, and I think we'll all look forward to seeing the results of that particular challenge. So thank you, everybody. Again, apologies that we couldn't really go into the questions as deeply as everybody would have liked. Again, we did only have an hour. It's a hugely important issue that I'm sure everybody here could talk about for 3 hours, but also you're all incredibly busy at the moment. But thank you so much for being a part of this. It is really important. And just thank you for making your time available so close to the election. So I will just wrap up with a little closing statement. He waka eke noa no reira tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you.